We're excited to have you back and back on the campus, and want to welcome back an alum as yourself, and he's here celebrating his 10th reunion from the class of 2004. And I'll read a short little bio here on Sahan. He is, as an Ohio Wesleyan student, he was the recipient of the Alice Bachelor Award. He was named the Outstanding Economics Major and was elected to the Omicron Delta Epsilon Honorary. Following his graduation, he received an MS in Applied Mathematics in 2010 and a PhD in Agricultural and Applied Economics in 2011 from the University of Illinois, where he was named Outstanding PhD Student Award by the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Economics. Today is an assistant professor in economics at Colby College and an assistant professor in economics by courtesy at Portland State University. His main research centers on ecosystem services and land conservation, and uses choice experiment surveys to understand preferences and mathematical programming to model optimal resource allocation. His survey work analyzes preferences on grasslands in Illinois, the tree shade program to manage water quality in Oregon, payments to prevent deforestation in Nepal, Ethiopia, and improved stove adoption in Ethiopia. His research interests have expanded to studying preferences, subsidiaries of renewable energy, and externally affecting hydropower generation. Sahan's research has been presented at more than 30 venues, including the World Congress on Resource and Environmental Economics, the Association of Environmental and Resource Economics Summer Conference, the Agricultural and Applied Economics Association Annual Meeting, and the Environment for Development Annual Meeting. Quite an impressive resume, wouldn't you say? Mm-hmm. Please join me in welcoming back Sahan.
Thank you for the nice introduction. Not sure exactly where they got the information from. But so it's my 10-year reunion, and actually second time I'm visiting. So it's nice to see this room full. I expected it being 10 in the morning on a Saturday that might not have a lot of people. And thank you for the three folks from my class. We were out drinking yesterday. Not true. But these guys stayed there. So this talk that I'm going to give, it's a talk that I'm building up that revolves around a collection of work. And it runs on this central premise that economics can help and assist when you're trying to do conservation work. So when you're thinking of protecting nature, when you're thinking of preserving nature, economics has a role. So I'm an environmental economist, and I teach conservationists, environmental studies students, and usually you see this tension that they come into the classroom thinking that economics is bad. It's because of economics that we've sort of destroyed the world and the environment is being destroyed. And so part of these examples here are trying to talk about the other side of this. That economics actually plays a really important role and can help when you try to achieve your conservation outcomes. Right? So that's sort of the central theme that I'm trying to get across. The way the talk is structured, I'm going to talk about what economists do, why we should actually worry about conserving the environment very loosely, and then I'm going to talk about some case studies. So I'm actually going to go into detail in some very specific examples, looking at military installations, protecting grasslands, how you incorporate climate change. So it is a little dense. So it might be a taxing talk at some level, but I do want to open it up for questions. So if you have questions anytime as we go along, feel free to interrupt me. Happy to clarify things. Happy to build up as we go along. So what do economists do? I'm curious. How many people in the room were economics majors? One. How many people have taken at least one economics class? Okay, a few of you. So you have a sense of what economists do, right? So fundamentally, economists approach the world using two kinds of ways. We want to understand how people behave, right? That's fundamentally what we're trying to do. In that sense, it's like most sciences. We use analytical and theoretical models. So we build up models about this is how the world is supposed to work. And then we try to see if those models are true. Right? One of the core fundamental principles of economics, you could say, is the idea of scarcity. Right? We live in a world that's scarce. We have unlimited wants. We have limited resources. How do we go about trying to maximize what we can get, given that we live in a resource-constrained world? So part of this is about how do we allocate resources. part of it's about how do we expect people to behave. Right? We want to use models to understand how people behave, because then we can use that information to try to incentivize people to do good things. And so that's fundamentally part of what economics is about. Sometimes we use this idea of numerical simulations, right? So unlike in the real world, we can't, unlike in a lot of sciences, we can't do experiments, right? Or we can't sort of set up natural experiments. It's harder, we don't have a lab that we can work with. So we do a lot of these numerical simulations where we generate data to see what outcomes might be. Economics also back up these models and the findings from these models using statistical data, right? So we collect lots and lots of data, and then we try to analyze the data to see what the data tells us about how people behave. And so economics is fundamentally this process of trying to understand how do people behave. At the same time, we run into this problem where we don't have information, we don't have full information about how markets work or the values of the things in this world. Right? So ideally, if we had full information, we would have this really nice model that tells us how things work. But we don't have that full information. So this leads to problems in sort of the economic framework that what's the value of nature, what's the value of some of these ecosystem services that we would like to have in our decision making, but we actually don't. So that's sort of a hole in the economic framework. But I want you to think of, what do economics do? We try to come up with the best way to allocate resources. And so that's fundamentally what we're good at doing. We want to figure out what's the best way to actually achieve a certain objective. So that's what economics do. So why should we care about nature? Why should we care about trying to protect nature? So what I have up here is some facts and figures that I'm getting from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which is a report that came out in 2005, trying to measure the extent of damages to nature and the current state of different ecosystems or different habitats throughout the globe. And the TEEB report, which was a follow-on in 2010, which was looking at the economic aspects of trying to protect nature. So one of the things you see here is that we are converting things, right? Increasing conversion of habitat to human-dominated landscapes. We're converting things to agricultural and urban landscapes. Only about 50% of forest area that existed when agriculture started, so about 5,000–6,000 years ago, remain today. So we've converted about 50% of forest globally. Humans have increased species extinction rates by over 1,000-fold. So in any natural system, there's extinction. Extinction is part of a natural system. But human activity has increased these extinctions by about 1,000 times. Globally intact ecosystems are being converted at about 1% per year. So every year, about 1% of intact ecosystems, connected ecosystems, are being converted to human-dominated landscapes. And that's a problem because when we think of protecting nature, protecting habitat, we care not just about having isolated plots of land, we want to have intact ecosystems. Right? And that becomes very fundamental if you want to get the services and the benefits that nature provides, that the land that you have is actually connected. So this habitat loss and fragmentation is one of the primary causes that actually leads to extinction. So it's not that we don't have enough unused land, it's just that it's in small patches here and there, which doesn't help. So it's some facts to try to motivate you as to why this is important. Do we care? And I'm using the word "we" very, very broadly. And I think the answer to this is yes. There's been global efforts to try to understand the extent of these damages and try to figure out what we can actually do. This decade, the UN declared this the decade for biodiversity. Right? So this is sort of a recognition of the importance of these issues from a global point of view. How many of you heard of IPCC, the Intergovernmental Platform on Climate Change? So the Intergovernmental Platform on Climate Change was something that was initialized about 15 years or 20 years ago. It was a global effort to try to get people from lots of different countries, politicians, academics, policymakers, trying to bring them together to try to understand what was causing climate change, what can you do about climate change. So it was a global effort. In the same way, we now have something called IPBES, which is the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. So this was an initiative that is, again, it's global. It has lots of countries participating, environmental ministers, politicians, policymakers, NGOs, and again the idea is what can we do in terms of protecting and preserving biodiversity and ecosystem services. And this was convened 2 years ago. So it's sort of work in progress where people actually try to understand what can we do. Last year, the World Bank started a project called the WAVES project. The WAVES project stands for Wealth Accounting and the Valuation of Ecosystem Services. And the idea of this is how do we value nature? And then how do we bring that values into our decision making? So fundamentally, the idea is when you look at a company's ledger, when you look at the accounting books, you not only want to look at the financial losses and profits, you also want to look at the ecosystem impacts. Right? So you could be making money in a financial sense, but if you're having big economic ecosystem impacts, that's a bad thing. So Dow Chemicals is the largest company that's actually in the process of incorporating this. There's a few countries that are working with this where when you think of GDP, you actually think of the idea of green GDP. So you don't look at just the typical material output, you actually look at also the impacts on nature. And so the efforts from all of these different international groups is to try to bring the value of nature into decision making at the company level, at the individual level, and at the national level. So it's sort of ongoing work that's continuing to happen. So I do think we care, right? So because we have these efforts that are actually happening. So what can we do? If we care about this, we have a problem, we care about it, so what can we actually do about this problem? So one of the things that we can do is we want to try to protect natural ecosystems and biodiversity. Sounds nice. We want to protect nature. At the same time, the resources that are available for conservation are limited. Right? We don't have as many resources as we would like, both in terms of money and in land, because there are other demands for this. This is why it becomes an economic question. This is why I, who is an economist, is talking about preserving nature. It's because we want to identify the optimal use of land and resources to protect nature. So if you think about it, economists are really good at identifying solutions to scarce problems. How do we allocate resources in a scarce environment? This is a very scarce environment. Conservation organizations have limited budgets. What do they target? We have limited land. How do we actually target conservation in a limited landscape? So this is an attempt where you can use economic methods to try to answer these questions. When you look at this problem, you have ecological and spatial aspects. You have to worry about things like species presence, size and shape of areas that you're looking at, the connectivity of lands, right? Are there corridors, are there connections between different species, relocation, clustering, do we actually have to move species, do we have to switch habitats around? So these are all ecological and spatial aspects, right? It makes sense if you think about protecting nature that these are important. But one of the things that people sometimes don't think about is there are a lot of economic considerations. The obvious one is cost and budget, right? What's the budget that you're trying to work with in terms of achieving your environmental objectives? But land prices matter. Land prices matter because till about 15 years ago, the general view was that if you want to achieve conservation, you would target the best nature land, right? So you want to maximize species, you want to identify the land that has no species. You want to protect wetlands, you identify the areas with the most amount of wetlands and you protect that. But then there's a paper that came out in Science in 1998 that said, look, this is not the best approach to do this. The economic approach to do this is look at the value of the land and then look at what land has the highest environmental benefit. And that way you avoid buying really expensive land and you can actually buy more land that might not be the best land. But because you're buying more land, you're actually able to achieve a bigger conservation outcome by not focusing just on the value of the environmental benefits that you're achieving. So land prices matter. Land prices also matter because there's dynamic effects. Right? So I have a paper that looks at this fact that if a conservation organization goes and buys land to conserve, what do you think is going to happen to the surrounding land prices?
Go up.
It's going to go up, right? People like to live next to nature. People like to be able to recreate. So surrounding land prices go up. So if the conservation organization comes back in 5 years when their next budget cycle happens, and they say, we want to expand, they have to pay more because when they made that initial purchase, as a result of that, they've raised surrounding land prices. So the outcome of this decision model in that paper is that if you're a conservation organization, don't spread your purchases around, so you have to keep coming back in subsequent years to expand because you're going to have to pay more. You should focus your funding on certain spatial locations. So this year, I'm going to buy a lot of this area so that I don't have to come back and expand. And next year, I'm going to go to another area. Right? So that kind of economic intuition, which makes sense when you think about it, comes out of these economic models. The idea of development. And do we want to protect land that is not under the threat of development? So it might be really good land, but if it's going to be good land in 10 years, you probably don't need to develop it, protect it, because it's not going to be developed. if there's land that's in an urban fringe that might get developed, even if it's not the best land, protecting that might be really important. So that aspect becomes important. And these last two, which is something I'll actually talk about towards the end in more detail, this idea of valuation and consumer preferences. We want to value the resources that nature gives us, because there's a lot of resources that nature gives us that are not valued. And I talked about the importance of incorporating that into decision making. But if you don't have values, how can you actually incorporate it into decision making? And so part of what economics can contribute is how do you value things that you don't typically buy in a marketplace. And then we care about consumer preferences, because at the end, you're asking people to make sacrifices. You're asking people to fund conservation organizations, not perhaps something where you're going to give up this farming land so that it goes into conservation land. There's sacrifices that people have to make, so it's important to understand what are consumer preferences, what are public preferences for protecting nature. So those are sort of some of the economic considerations that you need to actually think about. So I'm going to go through, I think, 3 or 4 case studies that illustrate some of these examples based on my work and based on work that other people have actually done. So the first one looks at conservation in a military landscape. Might sound like a surprising thing. It blew my mind when I first came across this project. Habitat areas for many rare and endangered species are actually on military land. This graph, or these two graphs, the blue is endangered species and the red is at-risk species. These are federal land management agencies. Okay, I'm pretty sure everybody knows what the DoD is. This is the Bureau of Land Management, United States Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife, National Park Service. So everything except for the DoD is actually tasked with protecting land, protecting nature, protecting species. The DoD is not tasked with protecting land or species, right? Their mission is completely different. They have the highest density of endangered species. So this is the number of endangered species per 100,000 hectares. They have the highest density of endangered species on any federal land. They have the second highest absolute number. So this is densities. This is the absolute number of species. They have the second highest next to Forest Service land. I mean, it's quite perplexing if you think about it, because that is not their mission, right? It's clearly not their mission. And I don't have a good answer as to why this is. From my general work and discussions, I think one of this is the bases are huge. Like, these are hundreds of thousands of acres. Most of the time the land is not used. It's, somebody might drive over it or fly over it and shoot across it, but the land is fairly in pristine condition. So everything else outside it is converted. It's either agricultural or urban land. So you have these enclaves of pristine land in military bases that are huge bases, and that's quite a high density of endangered species. Now, the DoD actually spends a fair chunk of change on trying to protect the species on its land. It spent $1.4 billion in 2006 on environmental protection initiatives. About 200 million of that was directly for conservation. At the same time, that's not their mission, right? So it creates tension, because the mission for the DoD is to be sure that you're prepared for war, that you have a training that happens regularly, that you're at a mission-ready state. Yeah.
I don't know if you know the answer to this question pertaining to the military specifically, but that number that you quoted up there with 1.4 billion, is that worldwide or just in the US?
US.
Just in the US.
Oh, I'm actually not sure. So this is the amount that the DoD spent on environmental related
Right,
things.
because I know we have bases all over the world, and
Right.
I'm thinking with the allocation of funds, and in some of the countries I've seen where living close to military bases, I don't think that money is being spent there. So that figure is a real questionable to me. I'm like, yeah.
So again, this is just the amount they spend on environmental aspects, right?
Yeah, right.
But I don't know if this is a national figure or their total budget globally. No, and again, this is really small compared to overall military budgets at some level. So, but I think part of the problem. So when I work with this military organization, one of the things they'll say is, this is not what we're supposed to be doing, right? This is what we're supposed to be doing. And the bases that I work with, they actually have 2 units. They have a land management unit that ensures the land is fine, in good condition, and they have a biodiversity sort of endangered species unit that tries to make sure that the endangered species are actually fine. Um, so in this particular setting, if you have to do training, how do you make sure that these endangered at-risk species are fine? One of the ways you can do this is by trying to identify land, so that you can say, this land we're going to try to protect as best possible within the military training framework. So you can use economic methods for resource allocation. How do you allocate scarce resources to actually do this? And there's two ways you can actually do that, right? One way is to identify the minimum number of sites, right? What's the minimum number of land or minimum amount of land you would need to be able to protect these species or provide these habitat areas? The other option is to say, I have a budget. Given my budget, what's the maximum number of species or the maximum amount of land that I could preserve? So these are similar but different problems. In one, you have a target and you want to figure out what's the least amount of land. In the other, you have a budget and you're going to try to figure out what's the most that you could do in this setting. When you look at these two models, you typically get outcomes like this. So if this is a landscape and the green areas are the sites that I'm protecting, if you just say, give me the best sites, it's what it looks like. I'm not an ecologist, but this is not good from an ecological point of view. Right? It's not good. It's like, right? So one of the things people have been working on over the last few years is coming up with models that give us results like this. We want results that are compact. We want results that are connected. Sometimes you might want multiple clusters. You could argue that you want species to be able to move around, but have some sort of a disease resistance, right? So instead of having one big cluster, you could actually have multiple small clusters. So part of the more current work is trying to figure out how do we get this kind of outcomes on a landscape when you're trying to protect land. Right? So this is what I'm going to talk about. This particular application, so I've worked with Fort Benning in Georgia and Fort Stewart in Georgia. Has a project with Fort Riley, which might not actually end up working out. In Fort Benning, Georgia, the motivation behind this work is they're moving in armor center. So right now it's an infantry training unit, training base, and they're bringing in armor units because there's sort of this realization that when you go out into the field, armor units and infantry units are working together. We want to create more opportunities where you can train together. So they're bringing in these armor units, and this base is about 250,000 acres. So this is Columbus, Georgia. This is about 250,000 acres, so it's a huge base. They have new firing ranges and maneuver areas that are being built, right? So they have these armor units coming in, they are working on this landscape. The reason I got involved in this is because there's one particular species that we're interested in, a type of tortoise called Gopher Tortoise. And that's what one of them looks like. They're about 10 inches long, so they're not very, very big. That's what the habitat looks like. They live for about 60 years, so these are fairly long-lived species. It's federally protected as a threatened species. The reason we care about these tortoises is it's a keystone species. There's about 360 other species that are actually dependent on the Gopher tortoise. So if you take these tortoises out of the environment, 360 other species would actually disappear over time. A big part of this is because they build a lot of burrows, and there's a lot of other species that actually use these burrows. They are also social species. So part of what we're trying to work with here is how can you relocate the Gopher tortoises in areas where there's going to be new training happening, and how can we find an area where we can move them in such a way that they can actually live. So there are social species. Right? So it's important to maintain these neighborhood groups. The herpetologists or the tortoise experts that I work with actually says that every afternoon they go and drink tea with their neighbors. And he will say this very seriously. He says they will walk around, they know their neighbors, they know who their neighbors are, they will sort of very slowly amble along and actually have a social interaction. So it's important when you think of relocating them to maintain those neighborhood groups. Because otherwise you're adding stress to an already stressful situation of being moved. So these are things that we have to think about in our model. How do we move species? How do we keep them together in a certain place and so on? This is what the data that I work with looks like. Right? So the blue areas are current military areas. The red areas are the new military areas where there's going to be this new training happening. This is where they have identified burrows of Gopher tortoises. So we want to try, so if you look at here, there's a lot of Gopher tortoise burrows in these areas which are red. So part of this is about how do we relocate them and where do we relocate them to. This is a map of suitability. So the darker areas are saying that this is a land area that's actually good for the gopher tortoises. Right? So we can't just put them anywhere. We want to try to move the gopher tortoises that are in the red areas to good areas from this map in such a way that we minimize the movement and we maintain these social groupings together. A quick aside, this hole in the middle is not because there's no gopher tortoises in there, it's because nobody can actually go in there. So they actually believe this would have the highest population of gopher tortoise burrows. This is a target area. So these are all shooting areas. So they would actually stay in these areas and shoot into this area. So it's a place with a lot of unexploded ammunition. Nobody can go in to actually count. But it's perfectly safe for a lot of animals, right? So it's not like it's a area that's devastated with bomb blasts. It's more unexploded ammunition or training ammunition. So they believe that's actually a high population in there. So how do we solve this problem? Well, we use a fairly complex mathematical model, right? And this is not something I'm going to go over, but I wanted to get a sort of talk. So it's really cool if you think about the fact that there is this huge mathematical equation that takes this landscape and tells us where we should move species to, right? So it's a nice way that you can think of how you can incorporate economic decision making into sort of a very mathematical framework, and then you actually get these very practical results. And there's, I could explain each of these in detail, which I'm not going to, but there's a story behind it, right? So there's sort of a meaning behind the equations. So what do we find? So again, we do a lot of different kinds of analysis, and I'm showing you results for the time we wanted to look for 2 clusters. Because we were looking for having multiple clusters to ensure there is survivability if something happens. Here's a model that gives us compact results. We find a cluster here and a cluster here. Right? So effectively, those are the areas that you would move these gopher tortoises for, and this is to support a population of 5,000. If you look closely, you can actually see there are some discontinuities, which is not ideal. So we then build a new model, and the new model actually gives us compact and contiguous results. Right? So in this case, some of the areas change, but now we have these connected areas. So they're compact and connected, and we can actually, they're not trying to fence these, but we could actually fence around these areas. But this is sort of how we use the data, and then we come up with these outcomes on a landscape that tells us what to do. So when you think about the key results that come out of this, we find that we can have these models, these mathematical models that have compactness and contiguity, which is important. But perhaps more important is the fact that we're finding ways that we can achieve conservation objectives in a working military landscape. And so we're not limiting the military's mission, and we are still able to maintain this idea of having conservation outcomes. There's also other applications. So political districting, school districting, these are all things that we could be doing. So same kind of methods you could use for political districts. So if you think of gerrymandered districts where you have political districts, you can use the same model, same ideas to think about political districts. Same for school districts. So the next example I'm going to talk about is a similar landscape level decision making example. But in this particular example, we didn't look at a dynamic element, right? We looked at, here's a landscape, where do you want to get stuff? But in reality, one of the things we want to think about is what happens in the future. And climate change is sort of something that's very serious. So this is not actually my work, it's a paper that came out in the Proceedings for the National Academy of Sciences. And it's quite a good paper, so I wanted to go through part of what they find here. So same idea, we have a landscape, we want to figure out where you want to protect on this landscape. But we're adding this dynamic element that with climate change, habitats are going to change. Right? And that's going to be really serious, because if I preserve these areas and it's a different area in 50 years, I'm not achieving my conservation outcomes. So climate change is likely to alter spatial distributions of species, habitat types, and there's a lot of uncertainty about what might actually happen. We don't know, right? We don't have good models of what might actually happen. Some solutions that people have talked about, increasing connectivity and adding corridors. So you have areas that are connected so species can move as habitats change. Increasing the number and the size, so you can have more areas. include uncertainty and expected values. So somehow try to incorporate the idea of expected values into this decision making. In this paper, they use what's called modern portfolio theory. Is there anybody who's from a finance, investment banking kind of? So this is something that finance folks do a lot of. The idea is you have a portfolio of stocks or assets. How do you figure out how you want to invest your portfolio? And the finance people are really good at figuring this out because that's their livelihood, right? That's what they do. This paper is really cool because it takes those methods from finance and applies it to a conservation problem. In this conservation problem, we have a lot of uncertainty. Just like we don't know the returns from stocks, we don't know the returns for conservation from the land that we actually select. So that's what they're actually trying to do. This is the model. This model is a lot easier for me to explain because that's what it says. Right? The central idea is diversify your stock portfolio. Diversify your land holdings to achieve the best natural outcomes you could. So that's sort of the central idea that actually comes forward from this work. It's applied to the prairie portfolio region. Beautiful. And it's an area that has about 200 bird species that actually live, not 200 bird species that actually live in this area. And the Fish and Wildlife Service actually spends about $3 million every year trying to protect land in this area. They do two types of analysis. They look at just the benefit. So if you just focus on benefits, going back to sort of the old idea of you want to maximize benefits, increase your benefits, and then they also look at benefits and cost. And so the cost changes over land, how does that change stuff? And they look at different climate outcomes. So we want to incorporate climate change into the decision making, just like we would model different stock outcomes. So certain stocks might be high, certain stocks might be low. We're looking at different climate change outcomes at different possible temperature increases. And I'm going to show you the results in a graph, and this is only for the benefit analysis. This graph that I'm going to show you has on its y-axis the benefits, or the mean benefits. On its x-axis, it has risk, how risky the outcome is going to be. So this is what the graph actually looks like. And the key thing to remember is, as you go up, you get more benefits. As you go to your right, you get more risk. So the general trend you see, it's an upward sloping line. So as you get more and more benefits, you also increase the risk. And that's bad, because if you increase the risk, that means you could go really high or really low. So ideally, we want to have high benefits and low risk, but that's not possible based on the way the stock market works, and also based on the way these land conservation models work. So this paper is really interesting because if you want to maximize your benefits, right, so you want to maximize the average return you get on your stock portfolio, for example, you would end up at these two outcomes. So these are actually two different probability scenarios. You would end up at these outcomes which give you the highest possible benefits. But they're also very risky. The key lesson that comes out of this, which is also found in the finance literature, you can reduce the uncertainty without losing a lot of the benefit. You could move from this area to this area, or from this area to this area, and you would lose a little bit of benefits, but you reduce your risk a lot. Right? So this idea of maximizing your benefits is not good when you're looking at high-risk situations. If you focus on both looking at the risk and the benefits, you can do better. And so being here is much better, even though you have less benefits, than being here because you have a lot less risk of something bad actually happening. And so that's sort of the central idea that comes from this portfolio maximization model. So the last thing I'll actually talk about, I removed on this, so I'm only going to talk about this, is the idea of how we use valuation. How do we, so the two examples I talked about are economic models that look at landscape level decisions. On a landscape, how do you identify sites? How do you figure out where you want to put your resources? This next example is the idea of valuation. How do you value things in nature that don't have a market value? Again, it goes back to this idea that we have incomplete markets. We don't have the value of everything that's good incorporated into the decision making that we do. And we can use surveys to figure out the values of some of these things. So this is sort of the central idea. There's a huge area in economics that talks about how do you value nature. How can you use surveys to actually do that? So this is an example that I worked on from one of these. So what are environmental amenities actually worth? what are some of the benefits that nature provides? We can define these as a functional ecosystem service. So we call something as a functional value if it provides a function. Examples of this would be things like erosion control, nutrient recycling, pollination, carbon sequestration. So there's a lot of benefits that nature provides without anybody having to do anything, where it's sort of a free benefit that we actually get. Is anybody from New York? New York City? Do you know where the water comes from in New York City?
Exactly where it comes from?
Yeah.
I think it's somewhere north.
From north, so it's actually from the Catskills mountain range, right? So there's actually, the water is not filtered in New York. They bought these lands that are huge land areas that naturally filter the water, and that's what provides clean water to New York. They don't pay for filtration, they don't have expensive filtration plants, it's free. Right? And it's a service that nature actually provides. There's a lot of other cities that spend a lot of money cleaning their water. Right? So that's a benefit that you get from these ecosystem services. So those are functional benefits because they provide a function. You also have the value that's held by people. So use values, recreation, you go and recreate on a natural environment. Or timber, you take timber from a forest. Those are use values. We have non-use values. So the existence of natural things matter. Right? If I just told you that I got a text message saying that the last polar bear died, I think a lot of you would actually feel some remorse. Right? You would feel some unhappiness at the fact that the last polar bear died. And that's because you have a value for the existence of things like polar bears, of things that you might not actually go and actually see. So how do we capture that value so that we can incorporate it into decision making? That's the idea of non-market valuation methods. Again, no market prices are available, so we need to figure out how much are people actually willing to pay for these services. And there's different ways that we can actually do this. So I'm giving you an example of one of these ways. This is an example, this is a picture of another one of these ecosystem services. It's an apple orchard in China. Does anybody know what they're doing?
They're hand pollinating.
They're hand pollinating.
There's no bees?
No bees.
There's no bees. So the bees have died out, mostly because of pesticide use. This is a problem that's becoming more and more prominent in the US. We have colony collapse disorder, bees are dying out. Bees are the source that pollinates about 70% of the food we eat. And so about 70% of the food that we eat is actually pollinated by bees. Here people are actually using paintbrushes to pollinate the apple orchard so that you actually have fruit. That's an ecosystem service that you typically would not value in the market. But if you have to pay people, then you're actually valuing it, right? You're actually coming up with a value for that. So part of this idea is how do we figure out the values for these things? And this particular example is one method. There's many methods that you can use. It's called a choice experiment survey. It's a survey instrument that asks people to make a choice between two different things, and then we can use the choice they make to get a sense of what the values are. We use them because they give us what I'm calling here part-worth utilities, which basically means they tell us how much people care about the individual components of what we're looking at. Right? This method comes from work by Max, so it's old, it's from 1966, which says people get utility not from the good, but from the attributes or the characteristics of the good. So when you buy a car, you're not buying a car, you're actually buying acceleration, legroom, the interior, the trunk space, that's what you're actually buying. When you buy a pizza, you're actually not buying a pizza, you're buying the toppings and the crust and the size. Right? So you're actually buying the individual attributes or the characteristics. You pay for the good, but it's actually those characteristics that matter. So that's the central idea behind this. And that's what we use in these surveys. I'm going to skip this research question part. So in this particular survey, we look at grasslands. And we're looking at grasslands in Illinois because they're actually disappearing. And when I talk about grasslands, I'm talking about areas like this. Right? So it has to be at least 100 acres, tall grass prairie, mixed grass prairie, some trees. So not like the little patches of grass that you see between highways, for example. We look at grasslands because 80% of grasslands in North America, have been converted. Does anybody know what that is?
Cities, fields.
Fields, crop circles, right? So it's fields that have been used for agriculture. So these are actual satellite images from Kansas. And it's pivot irrigated farms, right? So it's pivot irrigated because you have a water source and it's pivot irrigated, so the agricultural area is actually just the circles. This is what the landscape looks like. In Illinois, 99.9% of grasslands have been converted. So this is a map of grasslands from 1820. All the yellow areas are grasslands. This is a map that I generated trying to get a sense of the grasslands in Illinois right now. There's no grasslands. There's a smattering of small yellow areas, but those are actually small areas. So 99.9% of grasslands have been converted. And we care about grasslands for multiple reasons. One being, there's a lot of species that are endemic to grasslands. In Illinois, 17 out of 28 grassland bird species are disappearing. So that's a huge number of bird species that live on grasslands that are disappearing. Because we don't have grasslands, we have to restore them, right? You can't protect them because they're already converted. So you have to think about how do you restore these grasslands. At the same time, when you talk to restoration ecologists, they know a lot about the grasslands and how to restore them, but they don't know about what people care about restoring these grasslands. And as an economist, I think it's important to think of what the people's preferences are, right? Because you're going to ask people to pay for restoring these grasslands. You're going to ask people to not farm where there are grasslands. So it becomes important to think about what are people's preferences, how much are people willing to pay to protect these grasslands. But that's actually not being done. So this was the first study to look at valuing grasslands. When you do one of these surveys, it's really important that you identify all the relevant characteristics. Because if you don't identify all the relevant characteristics, different people are going to value different things. Right? You're going to assume something about a grassland that's different from what somebody else is going to assume. And that sort of destroys your survey instrument. So it's very important to collect all these attributes. And we do that. We spend about 2 years on this. And we end up with 7 characteristics of grasslands that we have in the survey. Species richness, wildlife population density, and the number of endangered species. Because one of the research questions that we look at in this work is, what do people care about in terms of conservation outcomes? Do they care about species richness? Do they care about population? Do they care about number of endangered species? So you can think of it like, you look outside, do you want to see lots of different kinds of birds? Are you happy if you see lots of blackbirds? Are you happy if you see the 2 endangered species that live in this area? What actually matters to you when you think of protecting nature? And so that's what we're trying to identify here. We include wildflowers because, surprisingly, one of the things, perhaps it's not surprising, one of the things you find is that people really care about wildflowers. And they're actually something that they notice when you look at natural landscapes. We include burns because I didn't know this, but the land managers told me you have to burn grasslands and people don't like it. So we include that because we want to get a sense of how that might affect outcome. And then we have distance and cost. So these first 3 are measures of success. This is what the survey instrument actually looks like. So this is one example of a question. We have about 80 questions like this. Here's one option of a grassland. So here's like car 1 or pizza 1. Here's the second grassland. And here's, I don't like any of these. I don't want you to waste my money. I don't want you to waste taxpayers' money to do this. And people would actually choose one of these grasslands. And these attributes in here change. And so you systematically ask people about grasslands with high species, grasslands with low species, expensive grasslands, grasslands that are closer. So these values in here change according to an experimental design process. And we ask a bunch of surveys, and then we can sort of use statistical methods to figure out what actually people care about and what's actually driving their decisions. So what do we actually find? I find that conservation planning initiatives should incorporate all of these attributes. So species richness, population density, and the presence of endangered species all matter to people. They care about all 3 of these. And so when you think about, oh, I'm going to maximize species and forget about everything else, that's missing part of the picture. People care about endangered species. People also care about having lots of species. The second research question that ran through this work was this idea of trying to get a sense of how the current presence of a grassland or some current presence of environmental public good might affect people's behavior. So think of this like you have 2 people. Joe, who has a grassland near where he lives, and I'm talking about a 100-acre grassland, and Sally, who doesn't have a grassland nearby. We asked both of them, we are going to make a new grassland. So for Joe, this would be the second grassland because he already has one. For Sally, it would be a new grassland. How many people think that Joe would be willing to pay more than Sally for this additional grassland? How many think Joe would be willing to pay more? He already has a grassland. How many people think Sally would be? So some of you think that Joe would be willing to pay more. How many people think Sally would be willing to pay more? How much do you think that Sally would be willing to pay more because you don't actually have a grassland, right? So economic theory doesn't actually help us a lot here. If you think about the idea of this downward sloping demand curve, right? So we have the story that if you eat a donut, you get happy. If you eat the second donut, you get a little less happy. By the time you're eating the 10th donut, you hate donuts. So that would sort of give you this idea that if you already have a grassland, you would like the next grassland less than somebody who doesn't have a grassland. But there is also this counter side to this, which is the idea that people's preferences evolve, right? So your attitudes change based on what you're exposed to. And if that's the case, the person who has the grassland could potentially value the grassland more because the person who doesn't have the grassland won't actually know about the benefits or how they're going to relate to this, which is really interesting if you think about it. Again, I'm not saying this is generally true, but in this particular case, for this study, we find that respondents with grasslands near have a higher willingness to pay. So it's Joe in this particular study who has a higher willingness to pay. This is not saying that's the result you would find in general or for other ecosystem services, but for this study, that's what we actually find. Yeah.
Wouldn't that be a little bit skewed though, saying that the people who live near grassland possibly chose to live there because they like it?
You should be an economist. So one possibility is preferences are involved, but the second possibility is locational sorting. Locational sorting is exactly what that point is. It's the fact that people who live close to grasslands are doing so because they like grasslands, right? So they originally made their decision. So when I come and survey these people, I'm definitely going to find that people who live close to grasslands are going to like grasslands more. So I actually can't distinctively say this is not the reason, but I also have this other question in here that asks, would you like non-grassland nature areas? And I find that people don't care about that. So it actually tells me that this is something just about grasslands and not about nature. So this would only be true if there were a group of people who didn't like nature in general, but like grasslands a lot, right? So if that happened, this could potentially be true, but I can't test it out. So this is one of the things that is a potential explanation. So it doesn't have to necessarily be this idea. But I like that question. It's sort of the big money question. If this is true, it tells us that valuing education is, taking people to see grasslands, see nature, has a big impact on how they then respond to initiatives to actually protect grasslands, right? They're willing to pay more, they're more, which makes sense if you think about it, and that is a possibility that comes out of this. And again, like I said, part of this is trying to understand how much are people actually willing to pay. What's the value of grasslands? And this is sort of a 100-acre grassland with some characteristics for those values. And here's what I find. So this is in a table because it changes, right? If you have a grassland nearby, you're willing to pay more than somebody who doesn't have a grassland nearby. If the grassland is closer, you're willing to pay more than if the grassland was further away. But even if the grassland was 100 miles away, you're still willing to pay on average about $80 to create and protect one of these grasslands. Again, this is per year, per household, right? So these are annual amounts of dollars. But that's a significant chunk of change that if you think about trying to protect grasslands. So these surveys help us actually value and come up with what these values might be. It has this, what we call distance decay. The further away it is, the less people are willing to pay because it's further away. And respondents who live near a grassland have a higher willingness to pay, right? So we find both of those. So key takeaways, right? From these three studies, I think one of the things that comes out of this is you can achieve conservation and productive use simultaneously on a landscape, right? So when you think about the military landscape, you can actually find this. There's been similar studies that look at agriculture and conservation on a landscape, and you can actually find ways to do both. In risky situations, it could be climate change, it could be life with your investment portfolio. Maximizing benefits may not be the best thing to do because it could be high risk. You could reduce the risk a lot by reducing the benefits a little. If that's the case, you're going to be on average at a better place by doing something like this. We find that people care about grasslands, right? And potentially education can influence their preferences. And that's a strong outcome because it says that you can actually benefit in a lot of ways. So key takeaways from a general point of view, I want to emphasize the fact that you need to incorporate the values of nature when you make decision making. But I didn't talk a lot about how you value nature and how you actually incorporate that into decision making. So these were some examples that show, if you know these values, here's how you do this in a landscape, here's one example of a method that you can actually use to extract these values. But there's a lot of other methods, there's a lot of other ways you can extract these values, and I think based on a lot of this international global work that's happening, we're sort of moving more and more into a direction of how do we incorporate this. And to be honest, the field is very new, right? So there are different methods and different measures. So somebody else doing a similar survey would find different numbers. And so one of the things we need to come up with is a good way to have a standardized system of doing this. Because you can't incorporate it till you actually have that. Valuation methods and resource allocation models can help achieve this. So this idea that economic methods can help conservation, I'm hoping is something that you'll take away from this. Lastly, I just wanted to talk a little bit about my doing this work. Where is it? How is it that I'm actually doing this work? So when I came to Wesleyan, I had never taken economics class. I was trying to do computer science. I double majored in computer science and economics. It was not something I had ever taken. Actually, in this classroom as well as in other classrooms in this building, took my first economics class with Ali Simon, loved it. Took a bunch more. Took a bunch of classes with Terry Rahman. It was something that changed my life. It was sort of, wow, this is really cool. You can actually do these things. And I'm somebody who double majored. I'm somebody who took like a bunch of philosophy classes and psychology classes. And to me, I'm right now at a liberal arts school teaching. And this idea of how a liberal arts school gives you the tools to tackle multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary problems. Right? It was because I'm using math, I'm using conservation, I'm using economics, and it's partly because of the broad thinking that I think gets instilled in a curriculum like this. And I wanted to, and again, you guys are all alums, but it's something that I fundamentally believe as being very causal to the work that I'm doing. Because had I been at another place, I might be doing a very narrowly focused aspect. But I'm able to sort of incorporate these broad aspects into this. And I think part of this is because we don't live in a world that's separated into disciplines. Right? You can't walk around and say, oh, here's the physics problem and here's the sociology problem. We live in a world where they're interlinked. And I think the liberal arts education is something that sets us up really well to tackle these interdisciplinary problems. So personally, I like working on these because I feel like it's being back at school, taking all these different classes because it's very different in some sense. So that's all I have. I think I almost ran out of time. So thank you for listening, and if you have questions, I'd be happy to take questions now. Talk to you.
So in your grassland study, the dollars are tax dollars, right? That you're asking,
No,
or
so
are
we
they
actually-
private dollars?
Yeah, so we actually counted this as a payment that you would pay.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm just doing a PhD in philanthropic studies. What do you think the implications are for fundraising and philanthropy? Do the environmental organizations go to the people that live near the grasslands and ask them to be the donors?
Yes, you do. And you also take them to see grasslands. Right? So put them on a bus and take them to go see grasslands, and then hopefully.
Columbus just ran an experiment on this, just so you know, with the zoo. I think, I don't remember what proposition it was, but it was pretty much, I think it was about $84 more per household in Columbus to expand and do other things at the zoo. And it was a huge debate. It was going on for like months, and it flopped.
Right.
Yeah. So, and people, if you ask people if they like going to the zoo, everyone will say, yes, we love animals, we love whatever. But nobody wants to pay that 84 bucks a month.
This is part of the difficulty with these.
A year. Oh yeah, a year.
Yeah, this is one of the difficulties with these methods, right? Because it's a survey method. You're not asking people to actually pay that amount. So there's another different kind of method called review preference methods where you actually look at what people have done, right? So if you travel somewhere, that gives you a lower bound. So if you come to your reunion and you spend $500 to come here, that means you're actually at least $500 happier by attending the reunion, right? So you can use the same idea in this setting. But you're right, with the state of preference, that's one of the concerns. Yeah.
Do you analyze the offset of you're restoring grasslands, but you're taking away corn or wheat lands and so forth, and that raises the price of corn and wheat and so forth. So what's the quote total benefit or loss? Do you take that analysis into account?
I'm glad you asked that question, and I believe you said you were the economics major. Right? So in this particular setting, I haven't done an analysis of what would happen, but these are small enough land areas that it's not going to have an impact on the corn production.
But at some point you would.
If you do a lot of it, right? So this is not saying that you should restore,
Back to 1820.
back to 1820 level, right? So it's having, the idea is trying to find the enough land so that you don't impact the economic outcome. So just like in the military outcome, you were able to do both, trying to find a way that you could do this without impacting the corn prices. And there are models, right? So there are models, this doesn't happen with grasslands, but with ethanol. So in the Midwest, we've been using a lot of ethanol out of corn. So there are these economic models that will tell you what's the food price impact or the impact on price of corn because of ethanol. So you could use a similar model to say, what happens if we did 200,000 acres of grasslands? Right, so you could use that, but right now the idea here is that you would do it in a way that it's not large enough to impact that food system or sort of the prices. But if it was, you can find that out. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for your presentation. This is very thought-provoking. It's a little bit off your presentation point, but for a long time this idea has been around credit buying and selling, and I wonder, and I think it's in effect in some ways now. What do you think about that? How successful is it?
What credits specifically?
Well, if you're in an industry, for instance, that pollutes less, or you can sell some of your credits to an industry that pollutes more.
Yeah, so the example that I skipped, I had another example I was going to talk about, which is actually looking at work I'm doing in Nepal and Ethiopia, where companies in the US, for example, could pay into a fund, buy credits, and the credits would be offset with tropical deforestation. So the money would go to tropical countries, and they would not deforest. So it's a credit, right? So two things. The credit programs only make sense if it reduces pollution. So if it's a one-to-one change, it doesn't make any sense, right? So if there's a company in the US that's producing carbon and saying that somebody can't use the forest and has to reduce a ton of carbon at a one-to-one ratio, we're not reducing pollution by doing that. So I think that type of credit program can be problematic. But if the idea is that the credit programs reduce the use, then they can be really good because they have these added benefits. Right? So the idea is that people for whom it's expensive to reduce can buy the credits, and the people for whom it's cheap to reduce can actually reduce. But we need to make sure that the cap on the credits or the total number of the credits is smaller than the amount of pollution that we currently have. Because otherwise it doesn't make any sense. So I think it's something you have to be careful about. Does that answer the question?
Yes. Thanks.
Yeah.
Is it possible in given areas, say Ohio, to see maps of areas that are under species conservation, I don't know the right words to use, and or potential?
Yes. I don't have maps for Ohio, but the Nature Conservancy in Ohio should. If you're interested in this, I'd be happy to send you maps or send you contacts for people, but most states you actually they've identified the areas that are high biodiversity importance.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. If there are no other questions, lunch is at 11:30, so we've got about 20 minutes or so, and we'll be in the Venice room. So thank you for joining us all today.
And thank you very much.